I'm Joe Lombardo. I'm the coordinator of UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition, who's hosting today. The meeting is formally sponsored by the Friends of Socialist China. There's a number of other endorsing groups, and the speakers are all members of those endorsing groups. As we introduce them, you will hear that. Now, 24 hours after the webinar, you will receive a message from Zoom and to all those people who have registered, and that will have a link to the video of the webinar, which we hope you'll share with other people. It will also be on the UNAC YouTube page, and it will also be on the, I believe, the Friends of Socialist China's Facebook page or somewhere in their social media. We are also going to start a live stream now on Facebook, and it will go to the UNAC Facebook page, which is called on Facebook /End the Wars /. And I am starting that now. And that should be going in a minute or so. We have a really good panel of speakers today, and it's an important topic as shown by the number of people that have registered and some other similar webinars that we've been doing recently. And I'm going to have to do something here for a minute. Sorry. So anyway, as we know, the main target of the the main target of the previous U.S. administration and the present U.S. administration has been China, because China, they're seeing as their main competitor in the world. China has made some incredible strides, cities that are futuristic, high-speed rail. They just made an incredible advance in AI, and a country that was a colony to some of the Western powers not too long ago is now taking a great leap forward to start to lead the world, and is challenging the hegemony of the United States, which has kept so much of the world underdeveloped for the riches of the Western imperialist powers. So we'll hear about this from various speakers today. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and then hopefully the folks in Arjae and Holly, who are in Portland, will be able to take over the chair of the meeting.
We're ready now.
Oh, they are ready. Okay,
yeah, we're all set.
Great. And you guys have the order, right, of speakers? It's on the Telegram channel. If not, the first one I will introduce, which is Keith Bennett, who is from the Friends of Socialist China. He's going to start, and then you guys can take over the chair after that and introduce yourselves as you do. Keith, you're up.
Thank you very much, and greetings, comrades. Comrades physically present in Portland, and over 250 people watching, it would seem, on the 5 continents. So that's like really great. So greetings from London, England, and it's an honor to participate in this historic united initiative of Friends of China and Friends of the Chinese Revolution. Now, as Joe just indicated, when the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, China was one of the very poorest societies and countries on earth. The subsequent political and economic trajectory of the People's Republic essentially falls into 2 distinct phases, with the second commencing with the launch of the policy which is known as reform and opening up from the end of 1978. The achievements of the first period, the Mao era, should not be underestimated or denigrated. They were among the most stupendous in human history. Life expectancy in China grew by 1 year for every year that Mao was in power. From being practically the poorest country on earth, Mao's China solved the basic problems of feeding, clothing, housing, and educating almost a quarter of the world's population, provided basic medical care to the whole population, brought literacy to the overwhelming majority, massively improved the social position and role of women, and so on, a whole range of further social and economic and political achievements. So why then was it necessary to make such a radical turn in policy in 1978? For all its progress, China remained at the time of Mao's death in 1976 a very poor country, although the basic necessities of life, as I've outlined, were more or less guaranteed. Whilst famine had been eliminated, food was still strictly rationed. Although disparities and inequalities remained, China under Mao may be considered to have been one of the most equal societies on earth, but to a considerable extent it could be described as a socialism of shared poverty. Moreover, at this time, huge changes were underway globally. Countries and regions around China were developing rapidly, albeit in many cases highly inequitably. However, this capitalist development in the region was then skillfully turned into a positive factor by China as its principal source of investment in the first stage of reform. For China at the time, such investment was crucial. It provided what the country desperately needed, a faster pace of industrialization and employment for those living in the countryside that could enable them to begin urban life, guaranteed export markets, skills and technology transfer, capital, technical and vocational training, and advanced scientific management. None of this would have been possible, at least not on the same scale, to the same extent, and at such a rapid pace, without the foundations that had been laid during the period of Mao's leadership. That is, without a basically educated, literate, and trained workforce, without housing and medical care, without a transportation network and paved roads that link to the whole country. And this is a major reason why Xi Jinping, from practically his first remarks when he was elected General Secretary of the party for his first term in 2012, has consistently stressed that the two phases of China's socialist development should not be counterposed to one another, but rather should be seen as two parts of a single revolutionary whole, one resting and building on the foundations laid by the other. In the last 4.5 decades since the reform period began, from a marginal position, China has become the world's second largest economy. It is the biggest manufacturer, largest exporter, and the major trading partner for 2/3 of the world's nations. It has rocketed up the value chain, increasingly leading the world in innovation and R&D. In just a few years, the whole country has been covered in a network of high-speed rail, accounting for some 70% of the world's total. Of course, no change as rapid and radical and on so vast a canvas as the process of reform in China could possibly unfold without, as a secondary aspect, some negative features. And these are essentially what Xi Jinping has been working tirelessly to correct since he assumed the leadership, inaugurating what the Chinese now call a new era, meaning a new stage in the long march towards developed socialism. Among the key features of this new era that we can identify are a merciless and ceaseless campaign against corruption, a rectification of the party's ranks, decisively returning to the concept of serving the people, a massive targeted campaign resulting in the historically unprecedented elimination of extreme poverty across the whole country, with careful follow-up to ensure that people do not slip back and that their lives continue to improve. Tackling pollution, preserving the environment, safeguarding biodiversity, and leading the global fight against climate catastrophe. Rolling out by far the world's largest program of medical care and insurance and old age pensions. ensuring that all sectors of the economy work in the overall interests of socialism, a reaffirmation of the central and guiding role of Marxism, and increasingly proactive foreign policy with the strategic goal of building a community of shared future for humanity and featuring increased support for and solidarity with the other socialist countries and a more dynamic engagement with a broad range of progressive forces internationally. Whilst China remains, in its own words, in the primary stage of socialism, the overall goal now is to build a modern socialist country in all respects by 2049, when the People's Republic will celebrate its 100th founding anniversary. And such an achievement will truly be something that will change the world. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. Sorry for the technical difficulties. My name is Holly. I'm one of the co-chairs for today. I'm in Portland, Oregon with the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. And I'm going to hand it off to my co-chair to introduce themselves and also some announcements.
Hi, my name is Arjae, and I'm with Workers' World Party Buffalo Branch, and Holly and I are presenting this panel today on behalf of the Friends of Socialist China. Just before we keep going with our speakers, I just want to make a few announcements about a couple books that we have available. If you're here in the library with us, we got a great audience. You can pick one of these up for a donation. We have 3 books here. We have The East is Still Red by Carlos Martinez, and if you're online, you can pick this up on Praxis Press, so keep an eye out for this book. We also have a new one, People's China at 75, The Flag Stays Red, edited by Keith Bennett and Carlos Martinez, also at Praxis Press, so you can pick this up as well. And we have another excellent book titled Why the World Needs China, Development, Environmentalism, Conflict Resolution, and Common Prosperity by Kyle Farana. And this you can pick up if you are online. You can go to ischinagood.org. And I just got my copy of this. I have not read it, but based on the table of contents, it looks very interesting. So please check all 3 of these books out. And all right, with that, we're going to give a couple introductory remarks and then keep going with our panels here.
Yeah, so to get started again, thank you for coming to this event, Defend Socialist China, on behalf of the Friends of Socialist China. The question of how one defines China is a topic that has, unfortunately, split the progressive left and socialist movement in Western countries today. There are many different views on how to characterize China. Right now, we aim to tackle the question by putting forward the viewpoint that the People's Republic of China, forged in the flames of revolutionary struggle of the workers and peasants, which has endured over the years against imperialist aggression, is a real workers' state that remains on the path to socialist construction. How we characterize China is a central question for all socialists, anti-imperialists, environmentalists, and everyone who values peace and justice in the world. In order to have an accurate view of China, we must have a perspective based on historical materialism, which not only looks at a snapshot of China as it is now, but takes into account China's whole journey from the first days of the revolution in a semi-feudal nation all the way to today, and where it aims to be decades from now.
For Marxists, China is the epicenter of the living, breathing global Marxist movement. This is where scientific socialism continues to adapt and evolve, taking on the challenges that the modern world offers in concrete applications. For the Chinese people, Marxism is not just a theoretical exercise, it is a method of action. Discussions of Marxist thought are thriving and widespread in China, and with new and innovative approaches being added to the scientific socialist tradition, which has otherwise been stagnant in many Western countries. This is for 2 main reasons. First, because People's China has walked further along the path of socialist construction than any nation so far. China today is trailblazing through uncharted territory of economic, technological, and social development. The roadmaps provided by the Soviet Union and other experiments in building socialism have been studied with a magnifying glass by the Marxists in China, yet none can provide an exact blueprint for navigating China's unique particular conditions and challenges of today. Because of this, China leads the whole world in the next phase of development of Marxist thought. The second reason is because China today has built the capacity to stand resilient against imperialism and even lay the groundwork for altering the dynamics of the world, which have been subordinate to US hegemony for so long. Many countries have embarked on an independent path towards socialism, but their revolutionary ambitions have been stifled by the economic and military encirclement and aggression by the forces of imperialism. Not only has China broken free of these limitations placed on it by the forces of global imperialism, but it has now surpassed the economic strength of the US empire, the bastion of world capitalism.
As China charges headfirst into the future, the ruling class here in the US lurches backwards, trying to reverse the march of history. Donald Trump has once again been placed in the throne of the empire at a time when US tensions with China are approaching a boiling point. It is clear that the working class and oppressed people of the US are at a crossroads. We will defend the People's Republic of China as our international siblings in the struggle against capitalist imperialism. Will we do that, or will our government throw us into a war against China that will destroy the world as we know it? In this moment, questions we've raised with great detail. We hope to allow you to see a side of China today that you have not been allowed to see. This is why we defend Socialist China.
The next speaker that we'd like to introduce is Danny Haiphong. Danny Haiphong is a socialist activist, writer, and political analyst. He's a weekly contributor to Black Agenda Report. His articles have also appeared in publications such as Mint Press News, Counterpunch, the American Herald Tribune, and the Center for Global Research Canada, and the Herald Zimbabwe. Danny is a co-founder of Friends of Socialist China, and Danny's talk today will focus on China's foreign policy and how it demonstrates that it is not imperialist. Go ahead, Danny.
Thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks to all the sponsoring organizations, to UNAC, and everybody attending this webinar. My talk was originally going to be about U.S. foreign policy, and it still will, Chinese foreign policy, and it still will be to an extent, but I actually want to focus on Donald Trump, because I believe there will be others who will be speaking about U.S. foreign policy and China's foreign policy and their comparisons. And, right now we are in Trump 2.0. It is here. And I want to talk about how in the United States, we end up being captive to narrative and spin, to cults of personality and their hubris. Individualism is powerful. Class consciousness and organization in the United States, not so much. So in this context, we actually find ourselves caught in this vortex of obsessing over Donald Trump. And indeed, Donald Trump puts on a show. Hundreds of executive orders and endless political theater acts have many Americans' heads spinning. Is Trump a peacemaker? Is he going to end the wars in Ukraine and elsewhere? Is a golden age of America coming? In my opinion, these are all the wrong questions, and China teaches us this quite dramatically. Why is this? Well, the United States is an empire. It is ruled by capitalist elites who see China as their principal threat. And they've spoken this through Trump's team. During his confirmation hearing, little Marco Rubio, called China the biggest threat to the United States. And his first meeting as a so-called top diplomat, if such a thing actually exists in the United States, was with the anti-China Quad: Australia, India, Japan, and of course, the United States. Yet at the same time, before Donald Trump was sworn in as president-elect, he said on the first days of his administration, he wanted the US and China to solve the world's problems together. But we have to look underneath these contradictions to find the singular goal of the US empire, and that is the weakening and containment of China. It isn't working. Trump isn't actually a signal of strength, despite a lot of the fear that many people rightfully and maybe wrongfully have of his new administration. He is a sign, actually, of a decaying empire, and you can see the weakness everywhere. Trump has clearly outlined a pivot back to the Western Hemisphere. Greenland, Mexico, Latin America, and the Panama Canal are all now in the empire's crosshairs. It isn't new. It's actually quite old. It's reminiscent of the mid-19th century drive of the United States toward manifest destiny. And while the U.S. empire has the means to cause utter destruction, we've seen that in Gaza, we've seen that in Ukraine, Trump's current trajectory is actually, in my estimation, a concession of long-term strategic defeat for the United States' empire. Because despite Rubio's bloviating that China is the United States' principal threat, China will not and cannot be contained, nor is it actually a threat. The explosion of Americans' use of the Chinese application Red Note has already taught millions of Americans in just weeks of time why China is not a threat to them. Quite the contrary, China offers an example of a prospering society that is increasing the standard of living of the people there. Chinese tech is not based on theft, nor is its economy declining. Actually, China has just surpassed the United States in another realm of technology, open source AI, artificial intelligence, and its steady 5% GDP growth, replete with state-of-the-art infrastructure, has no end in sight. U.S. sanctions on Chinese tech have failed. U.S. militarization, the encirclement of China in the Asia Pacific, has failed. The U.S. under Trump truly does not know how to approach China at this time. It is certain, however, and we have to be very clear about this, that the aggression will ramp up again. After all, Rubio's words are not actually his own. They are the concoction of a so-called national security strategy that was adopted under Trump's first presidential administration and continued and escalated in Biden's administration. So let us deal with the facts when it comes to China under Trump 2.0. Fact number one, while rhetoric may come and go, get more hostile at times and less at others, the overall trend of U.S. imperial aggression toward China remains on the upward trajectory, regardless of whatever duopoly party is in the Oval Office. Obama began the pivot to Asia and sent 60+% of the United States military, naval, and other assets to China's doorstep. Trump then added sanctions and tariffs and propaganda war, color revolution style interference. And then Biden increased all of this under the guise of strategic competition. And fact number two, which is going to be critical in the Trump administration that we find ourselves in, short of nuclear war, China simply cannot be stopped. Short of nuclear war, China is primed to defend its sovereignty with a state-of-the-art military. Its economy is robust and has planning mechanisms that ensure flexibility and rapid changes when conditions require it. Its political system is arguably the most legitimate in the world, enjoying widespread popular support. Its economic integration with the world's poorest peoples and nations ensure that the foundations of a new development path are being built, ones that foster resilience in the multipolar world and move away from the fragile and crisis-ridden U.S.-led unipolar world. Its own Belt and Road Initiative is now 200 plus countries strong and $1 trillion in total development. This is not to mention China's leading role in the BRICS and other multilateral mechanisms, which China plays a central role. And then fact number three, maybe the most important fact of all here, is that the U.S. empire is, in fact, a declining empire, no matter how it may look on the world stage in places like West Asia. Syria, we saw the fall of Syria, which was devastating to the anti-war and anti-imperialist movement. We've witnessed the 1+ year now, a year and a half of genocide in Gaza and so many other world calamities. But none of these have actually strengthened the empire's hand. The U.S. simply cannot hold on to West Asia. It's losing its dominance there. every single day. It's already lost legitimacy in much of Latin America. It has no presence in Africa beyond military occupation and provocations. This means that it will rely on increasingly military means to get the empire's dirty dealings done, and that includes to provoke China. There is no other option the United States has at this point. But the problem is that the United States actually can't get into a hot war with China. That would be absolutely suicidal, not only for the total global economy, capitalist and otherwise, but also because all the war games have shown that the United States cannot win this war, that it ends up being a stalemate or a draw, or however the war makers and think tanks like the Center for New American Security want to spin it. But the truth is that the United States couldn't defeat Korea, could not defeat Vietnam, could not defeat Afghanistan, could not defeat the people of Palestine in Gaza who were fighting urban guerrilla warfare under the rubble. The United States empire simply cannot defeat really anybody at this time. Suffering caused? Absolutely yes. Defeat and victory? Absolutely not. So the only option the United States has with China, the only way it will get to this overall strategic competition finality, this grand ending to toward the war to end all wars, is nuclear war. That's the only option left in the United States' arsenal, and that's why this moment is incredibly critical. This means that we are all in danger until we confront the forces that are moving us toward war with China. The closer the United States' empire gets toward war with China, the closer we are ultimately to nuclear war. China has nuclear weapons and developed nuclear weapons. It tested its first in 1964 and never let go of the no first use policy. The United States has already used nuclear weapons and has shown that it's willing to spend trillions of dollars to renew them, to create more of them, and has already, under the Biden administration before Trump, talked about how it is going to revamp its nuclear strategy in case of the need for future use of nuclear weapons. China was included on its list of the DPRK, Russia, and Iran. So all of this is to say is that this is where we are right now. And the Trump administration is having to navigate contradictions that it simply cannot navigate. And what is going to end up happening is that we saw this in the first Trump administration. There will be a bit of a honeymoon, a bit of a cooling period. The Trump administration, like most U.S. administrations, cannot afford, short of a crisis like 9/11, to simply jump into war at this time. But make no mistake, there's 4 years of this Trump administration, as long as the United States is the empire, the capitalist empire that it is. And I believe we will see soon enough the United States under Trump reorient itself back to China. Little Marco Rubio and the rest of his team are primed to do it. And that means we are all going to have to be ready to oppose these anti-China narratives, to expose people to the real China, and to build those people-to-people ties and the necessary solidarity to ensure that we roll back this war machine once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Good. All right. Next up, we have Sanyika. Sanyika is a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party and has recently returned from China. A fierce opponent of imperialism, Zionism, and colonialism, she is speaking today to dispel the lie that China is colonizing Africa.
Thank you. Also, I'm trying to load up a presentation, but if I don't have the visual accompaniment, it's fine too. But yeah, I think everyone is pretty well aware of the propaganda in line that China is colonizing Africa. I think it's one of the most pedestrian talking points, but it is one that, as a member of the African People's Revolutionary Party, we have to be prepared to dispel and explain to people exactly why that is propaganda. Because even in law school, I hear this line every day. But I think it's important that we go over what colonialism actually is. And so I'm going to go on the Frantz Fanon note here, where he describes colonialism as a system of violent dispossession, which is depriving someone of land and property, and hyperexploitation. And as Frantz Fanon says, colonialism is violence. This is not because of simple racist feelings or rhetoric, but it is a system of resource extraction and economic exploitation that restructures the world into civilized nations and uncivilized savages. This rhetoric is actually one of the most important components of colonialism, and it's one of the ones that you don't necessarily truly see on the Chinese side today when you try to compare Chinese resource extraction with European resource extraction in the African context. And this manifests in the way that we divide the world into the West and the third world / the global South. Note that the world has already been divided into the West, or so-called first world, and the third world. And so the relationship that exists between China and Africa, as we see, has steadily grown into the world consciousness, and it is at its peak for sure. But with this, there are different receptions, I guess, across the so-called international community, which is often full of Westerners, giving their opinions and kind of applying them universally. Some would say this renewed interest in Africa by China is simply a new stage of colonialism, with the Chinese at the helm of the vast exploitation of African nation, as opposed to her former European administrators. This analysis, however poetic and moralistic, is uncompelling once viewed in the light of the material and complex reality of Chinese investment on the continent. It also lacks an understanding of not only Chinese political and economic priorities, but also African interests. So in order to do that, we have to look at the root of China's engagement with Africa. And I will be honest here, we're going to start the clock when the PRC itself was founded. Anything before that is not relevant to the current administration, I guess you could say, in China. So the history of PRC Africa relations goes back all the way to 1945. The notion that China has a sudden interest in Africa must be rejected on its premises, right? The founding of the People's Republic of China was hallmarked by its militant internationalism and hope in the revolutionary potential of the Third World. Out of 22 non-communist countries that established diplomatic relations with the PRC between 1958 and 1965, 17 of them were African. 14 sub-Saharan African nations established diplomatic ties with the PRC immediately following its independence. It is in revolutionary Guinea that China found one of its first close allies in Ahmed Sékou Touré, who is one of the founders of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. And so between 1960 and 1969, a loan from the PRC financed the construction of Guinea's first oil processing factory, a bamboo processing center, a cigarette and match factory, a tea plantation, and more. We're going to see this trend as we look through Pan-African figures that I've listed here into what exactly their priorities were when engaging with China and how similar they are to China's priorities on the continent even today. So I would say, right, and we're not going to do a full history session, but the true foundations of modern China's policy towards Africa actually lie in the often overlooked Bandung Conference. This is the ideological and political predecessor to the non-aligned movement. This is a convening of Afro-Asian cooperation, and it laid out the primacy of the struggle against colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism, and it opted out of Cold War bipolarity in favor of cooperative economic development. Big emphasis on cooperative economic development because that is basically the baseline of China-Africa relations in the PRC age. This is a lot, but we're going to go through it. So China aided and financed the construction of what is famous in Africa and known as the Tanzam Railway that connected the newly independent states of Tanzania and Zambia. And this construction effort resulted in a government revenue deficit of 1.2 billion RMB. And this is before pre-reform China. So China taking on this huge loan for the effort of showing solidarity to these newly independent African nations really does not explain itself well under a colonialist framework here. And of course, you can look more about the Tanzam Railway, but I think this might be a little too chunky for our purposes today. But I will end up by saying China's interests in partnership with African nations have been an essential foundation for the very principles of the PRC itself. 1978, China supported aid programs in more African countries than the United States did. And understanding the historical basis for this relationship is crucial for contextualizing China's role in African development today. Next, we'll get on to Kwame Nkrumah in China, because when people talk about colonialism, they also mention neocolonialism when they talk about China's relationship with Africa today. But when you ask most of these people where they even get the term neocolonialism from, Kwame Nkrumah does not leave their mouth. Neither does Jean-Paul Sartre, which, I mean, I'm okay with that. But they don't even know where they're sourcing the word colonialism from. And so the most recurrent critique that we hear that China's relationship constitutes neocolonialism doesn't even contend with the root of the term itself, which is in revolutionary Pan-Africanism. Obviously, Kwame Nkrumah is the other founder of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. So it's good that we actually take his analysis, his approach to China, and his understanding of neocolonialism to actually look at the relationship today. So obviously, the analysis of neocolonialism did come from Jean-Paul Sartre's colonialism and neocolonialism, but it actually gained its first true form and practical application at the All African People's Conference. And in its 1961 resolution on neocolonialism, Kwame Nkrumah basically takes that term and then writes his work, which is amazing. And if you can get your hands on a copy, you should. It's very expensive. Neocolonialism, the highest stage of imperialism. And this is meant to expound upon the theory of imperialism that is given by Vladimir Lenin. And just to go over neocolonialism very briefly, the essence of neocolonialism as a state is that in theory it is independent and has all the outward trappings of sovereignty, but in reality has an economic and political policy that is directed from the outside. So when people talk about Chinese neocolonialism, as in Chinese resource extraction from the African continent, they're just talking about colonialism. They don't even have the neo analysis added because they're just talking about resource extraction. They can't actually describe a way in which economic and political policy from an African standpoint is influenced by China in an internal sense. They can't name, Chinese corruption. They can't name that people are being forced to speak Chinese in the same way that Kwame Nkrumah is trying to characterize what exactly neocolonialism is and how that affects the African continent. He also says that the result of neocolonialism is that foreign capital is used for exploitation rather than for the development of underdeveloped parts of the world. When we look at China today, 90% of its investment in Africa went towards critical infrastructure as opposed to the structural adjustment approach favored by the West. And lastly, what is most important is understanding that it was in Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana that China's Zhou Enlai laid out the 8 principles for China's aid to foreign countries that outlines China's commitment to the principle of equality and mutual benefit, of which China still operates on today. As Nkrumah states, the struggle against neocolonialism is not anti-developmental, and it's not aimed at excluding the flow of capital from the developed world from operating in the less developed countries. It is aimed at preventing the financial power in the developed countries from being used in a manner to further impoverish the less developed countries. When people talk about Chinese involvement on the continent today, it is a very anti-developmentalist standpoint that they take, and it is one that is contrary to the values of Pan-Africanism. I also got this quote from Zambia's former prime minister. His name was Kenneth Kaunda, and he remarked that every time there's a communication network between the African countries, that is a step nearer to the end of our continent's balkanization on which imperialism has fattened itself. So if Africa's giants saw their relationship with the People's Republics and its principles of mutual benefit as a vital one for the struggle in neocolonialism, why can't we? If Kwame Nkrumah and Ahmed Sékou Touré saw that Chinese loans, saw that mutual benefit, saw that mutual economic cooperation was essential in their dealings with the PRC, why do we see the same relationships today, even though they're being made by African figures that we can all admit might still be neocolonial puppets? The nature of the relationship has not fundamentally changed. And so without firm grounding in the Pan-African and revolutionary roots of the Chinese relationship with Africa, it's impossible to truly understand the significance and posture of this evolving partnership. The then premier Zhou Enlai remarks bode well here when we're stating in reference to Chinese aid, it is not their intention to make them dependent on us, and that Africans would need to rely primarily on their own efforts to free themselves. An oversimplification based upon reference to European and American interactions with African nations ignores the most radical contributions made by African leaders who forged the path that the panda and the lion walk on today. That's about it. But yeah.
Thank you, Sanyika. That was a truly excellent presentation. We appreciate that a lot. Next up, we have Mick Kelly. Mick Kelly is a founding member and part of the political secretary. Founding member and the political secretary of Freedom Road Socialist Organization and the editor of Fight Back News. He's been active in movements for peace, justice, and equality and liberation since 1970. Mick Kelly will be speaking about the Pentagon's plan for war with China and Trump's anti-China agenda and how tariffs benefit corporate wars here. Thank you, Mick.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the warm introduction. And I'd like to send my warmest greetings to all of you who have gathered in Portland for this important event, and all of us who are together on Zoom today talking about the role of China, because I think it's indeed important and necessary to understand China if we are to understand the world. And if we don't understand that, it's impossible to change things. So in any event, on January 20th, Trump stood in the Capitol Rotunda promising a golden age of imperialism and vowed to stop the decline of the U.S. empire, which in fact is something that he cannot and will not do. It's impossible. In fact, the opposite is the case. Trump and company will in fact accelerate the decline of American imperialism, of monopoly capitalism, and increased military spending. The deployment of more military forces to the Pacific will not change that. Overall, the long-run decrease in economic power will be followed by a decline in political power. That's a general principle. The role of the United States in the world economy is shrinking. It's declining in an absolute sense. In 1960, the US had about 40% of the world GDP. Today, it's about half that. The reality is the US has abandoned projects that put it at the center of the international economy. A great example of that is the World Trade Organization, which many of us fought. And I think at this point, we can say it's kind of arriving at its end. Likewise, the 2017 withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, something that was carried out 8 days into the last Trump administration, is another symptom of deterioration. The relative weakness of the US economy in the world today is actually accompanied by a fragmentation of the world economy, and in fact, the rise of inter-imperialist contradictions. Looking at the statistics from the International Monetary Fund to compare the size of respective economies, People's China has in fact surpassed that of the US using the metric of purchasing power parity, PPP for short, which allows us to compare what commodities and services can be purchased with a given currency. We can see that in 2024, China had about 19% of the world GDP, while the US had declined to about 14%. One could also look at a host of industries from auto to shipbuilding to steel to green technologies and see that the United States is being left behind. And in fact, just give one additional example. If I remember correctly, China has about 50 times the shipbuilding capacity as the United States, which is on many levels a truly remarkable thing. And so when we are looking at US policy and plans in the Pacific in general, I think there's two things that we need to keep a handle on or keep in mind in terms of what's coming next. First of all, there's a fair amount of overlap on China policy pursued by the Democratic and Republican politicians. While we can say with some confidence that Trump will be unmatched when it comes to xenophobia, chauvinism, warlike rhetoric, there's a certain reality, which is that both administrations, the Biden administration, the Trump administration, have had policies that are roughly similar. For example, when U.S. Defense Secretary Austin was testifying in the 2024 Defense Appropriation Bill in front of the Senate Armed Forces Committee, he stated this: this is a strategy-driven budget, one that is driven by the seriousness of our strategic composition with the People's Republic of China. And so the second issue I think that it's important to keep in mind is the whole issue of Taiwan province. And that's really the great unsolved issue of the Chinese Revolution. It's something that remains to be done. And there's a reality here too, which is the US has long encouraged the most reactionary and separatist forces as part of a project to contain China. And Chinese Communist Party Secretary Xi Jinping was entirely right to say, the people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait are one family, and you can never sever our family bonds. No one can stop the historical trend to China's reunification. The the Communist Party of China, has also made it clear that this separatism will not be allowed to flourish forever. Biden also stated that the U.S. would intervene in a conflict to reunify China militarily. And Trump has said, well, China's very afraid of me, so nothing possibly can happen. Myself, I agree with Xi Jinping. Reunification, it's inevitable. Looking at the issue of tariffs and trade, and it's for me, it's kind of a funny thing at a late age in my life to become very interested in things like tariffs when I've spent a lot more of my life devoted to trade union questions, but tariffs are important. And countries enact tariffs, and they generally do so to protect internal markets from industrial development, for the purpose of industrial development. But monopoly capitalist powers in decline have a different reason to do so. What they want to do is protect internal markets when they have failing industries and industries that have low levels of productivity. And in China, exactly the opposite is taking place. For example, let me take the steel industry. China has built an extraordinarily advanced steel industry that's much greater than the United States. The United States steel industry in many places looks like it's from an antique museum. It's really something that's lagging behind. And so there's a reality is the U.S. is now putting lots and lots of tariffs on Chinese steel. It's not really competitive. The Biden administration kept many of the China tariffs from the first Trump administration. I think Danny mentioned that. And he kept, Biden actually upped tariffs on things like electric vehicles and aluminum. Now Trump, he bills himself as tariff man, somebody who has vowed to take this whole thing to another level. So he talks about 60% tariffs, 100% tariffs on electric vehicles. He talks about 25% tariffs, but probably most significantly, he's talking about 10% all-around tariffs on February 1st, and I think that's something we're going to have to see. But one impact of tariffs for sure is going to be an upward pressure on prices in the United States. And many of us here are tired of inflation, and we're tired of these conditions. And one thing that tariffs will not do is bring back industry. Certainly there can be some impact in that regard, but it will not. And the reason is simple, that basically with the development of the productive forces, with the development of automation, many of the industries that we're talking about, the manufacturing we talk about, will not bring back great addition of jobs. So tariffs are not going to do what Trump says they're going to do. There is also important political and military dimension to this whole thing of delinking the economies and protecting supply chains. And it's also worth noting, and I think this is in terms of a terrain of struggle in the US, that one of the factors in prolonging the Great Depression of the 1930s was high tariffs. And I think in many ways, the US is overdue for an economic decline. It's been about 10 years since there's been a major crisis, and maybe a little bit more actually. And the US typically has them every 5 to 7 years. Taking a look at kind of some of the future developments that we can expect, one of them will be a continuation of the massive military buildup that's taking place in the Pacific. And it's going to be things like increased defense spending, things like basing more missiles, for example, the Typhoon missiles, which are being based in the Philippines. And it's stuff like the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. And there's no reason to think that the Trump administration is going to slow down on the armament program that the Biden administration has had. General U.S. Strategy, in addition to the arms race, has been drawing the countries of the Pacific region into hostile alliances, formal and informal, against China. Some of the other speakers have already mentioned them. But I think Trump is going to have some challenges doing that, not because there's all sorts of progressive countries everywhere, but rather because Trump is not good for his word. And I think it's going to be more difficult for him to pull together different alliances to oppose China. On the balance, it can be said that the U.S. is on the road to greater conflict with China, and the possibility of the U.S. provoking a major war cannot be ruled out. In fact, it's a likely consequence of the direction things that are now heading. So to wrap it up, progressives, revolutionaries, those of us in the anti-war movement, we need to stand with China. China has done nothing wrong. In fact, it's developing socialism and working for peace. And no surprise, China has friends all over the world, including, I'm certain, on this Zoom call and in Portland. We are going to have a busy time ahead of us these next 4 years. We have an enemy in the White House that wants to wage a war on China, on the peoples of the world, and people here at home. It's our job to make sure, to be certain that this war is not a one-sided one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mick. China certainly does have friends in Portland, that's for sure. So for our next speaker, we're going to have Sara Flounders. Sara Flounders is a political organizer, the author of 10 books on U.S. militarism, and active in people's movements for change for 50 years. She coordinates the International Action Center and Sanctions Kill campaign, works actively with the United National Anti-War Coalition, and is a contributing editor of the Marxist newspaper, Workers' World at workers.org. Sara will be speaking today on why China is not imperialist. So I'm going to hand it off to her.
Well, thank you, Holly, and thank you to Arjae, and thank you to all the organizers in Portland for making today possible. And greetings to the hundreds watching on Zoom and on the stream and on the future postings. I want to begin today with a salute to the incredible historic victory of the United Palestinian Resistance, because it confirms to all the people of the world that revolutionary morale and determination are stronger than billions in high-tech weapons that U.S. imperialism provided to its Israeli proxies. The enormous power, as a best example, unleashed by the Chinese Revolution, its mobilization of the most oppressed, led by the Chinese Communist Party, is a real driving force in China's rapid modernization and leap from grinding poverty, illiteracy, famines, and imperialist dismemberment. It's people's power that changes history, and sharply. Just as Palestinians struggling for their land are labeled terrorists in Western propaganda, debunking the notion that China is just a vicious imperialist country is a crucial part of opposing the US narrative. The imperialist countries pump the China threat relentlessly and use it to justify a war mobilization against China. So we need to deal with this head on. This is a demoralizing, disorienting slur at a time when we need to be uniting the broadest possible forces against US-led war. What we defend in China is what Wall Street wants to destroy. Many on this panel defended China when it was an overwhelmingly impoverished, largely illiterate peasant country, storming the heavens with revolutionary fervor that inspired millions around the world. The Chinese Revolution was a world historic, massive social upheaval. And we defended China for the same reason that we defend every gain of the working class, every painful step forward for our class, every organizing drive, every union struggle, every liberation movement, because we take sides in the class struggle. It's a global struggle. Now, none of these struggles are picture perfect. They run up against real material limitations. But what's the difference, China and the US? China does not engage in regime change, destabilization, unilateral sanctions, economic coercion in pursuit of its economic interests. The US does. China does not have a global infrastructure of military bases. The US has more than 800 military bases, armed forts around the world. China's state-owned industries aren't driven to extract profit from every transaction. They're actually liberated to solve real problems and human needs. US corporations, every one of them, must extract profits for shareholders every quarter. Profits are their lifeblood. China is very open in admitting that they're building toward socialism. They're not yet a socialist country with full equality where everyone's needs are met. The Chinese economy is still unevenly developed. As they explain, they're far from being a communist society, but they are using the vehicle of a workers' party, a communist party, to determinately improve conditions of life for millions of people. They make compromises. There's a capitalist class in China, some wealthy individuals, but the capitalists are not the deciders. China remains a worker state with a socialist economic foundation, but it's forced to exist within the worldwide capitalist system. There's an irreconcilable difference in property relations, in class relations, in an imperialist country, and in an oppressed and formerly colonized country building a socialist economy. Now, the big question for Marxists is, who does the state serve? In China and here in the US. As Lenin stated, the question is, which class controls the state? That's absolutely vital in answering the question of whether or not China is an imperialist country. Now, all the top Chinese companies are state-owned, publicly owned by the whole people, not a handful of billionaires. And that includes the banks, the oil companies, gas companies, gold, rare earth minerals, insurance companies, the high-speed railroads. There's a state monopoly of trade. Key industries like finance and technology and manufacturing, energy, aerospace, and chemicals, these are all state-owned enterprises in China. The rich resources and industries and essential communications, this is the largest source of profit in every society, and it's why the US wants to control it. And that's the source of their anger. It's all controlled and owned by the Chinese state for the benefit of all the people and not a handful of billionaires. There are now 600 million workers in China, and that's larger than the entire working class of all the G7 imperialist countries together. There's nearly 100 million Communist Party members who are elected by their peers at every level, who are committed to defending socialist property rights. They study Marxism in the most creative ways as an evolving science. The sheer size of a politically conscious, highly organized, communist working class organizations and leadership, that's a powerful bulwark against imperialism. Now, capitalists from around the world can invest, make a lot of profit, but they can't just pull their equipment out. By law, China owns it, and Chinese staff must be trained to operate it. Imagine that. The imperialist corporations consider these restrictions on foreign investments to be property theft. They want to be able to do what they did inside the US, pull out their factories, their equipment and technology, and leave behind a rust belt and millions of unemployed workers. They can't do that in China. Now, because China has maintained a planned economy and state ownership of core industries, it's been able to avoid the economic crises, those horrific recessions and depressions that hit all capitalist economies every 7 to 10 years. China's economy even weathered the 2008 capitalist crisis that brought finance capital to the brink of collapse. This is proof that the global capitalist market is not dominant, and it's not the billionaires driving the decisions. Now, a few Chinese capitalists are actually allowed into the Communist Party of China, but that brings them under party discipline. And it's another mechanism by which the CCP can assert dominance over their corporations. China retains public ownership of all land. Land can be leased for a specific time, but what is built has to conform to a plan. China's Belt and Road Initiative, it really is liberation for the world, for the global South, for the formerly colonized countries. It's an attempt to connect China with other countries and to build up economic development of each country. Now, for 30 years, from 1949, the Chinese Revolution, to 1979, 78, 79, China's efforts at growth and modernization were made so much more difficult by the US imposed sanctions, total blockade. But in those years, China reorganized a chaotic, war-torn, underdeveloped society, building technology, basic infrastructure, educating the working class and the vast peasantry. It's what made the next step possible. China's opening to investment in 1978 was conditioned on the West lifting its strangling economic sanctions that had barred all technology, industrial equipment, investment, and trade. It was a risk, a deal with the devil, especially because imperialism saw it as a possible way back into China. Now, through growing coordination of socialist planning for over 75 years, the conditions of life for millions has steadily improved. Today, workers in China are benefiting enormously. 800 million people out of total grinding poverty. Wages in China have doubled in the last 10 years and the previous 10 years before that. And here, real wages in the US have stagnated since the 1970s. Profits have soared, but so has inequality. In education, China produces more science, technology, engineering, math, the STEM graduates than the rest of the world combined. Now, consider debt. In the US today, almost all workers live their lives in debt. 41% are in medical debt. Millions are overwhelmed by student loans, car loans, paying mortgages, struggling to make rent. Loss of a job can quickly lead to homelessness. But for 3 generations, 75 years since 1949, Communist Revolution, debt is almost unknown in China among workers and peasants. Before the revolution, millions of people had been born into debt, carried the debt of their families, forced to sell themselves and their children to landlords to pay off debts. So we have a responsibility to answer the attacks on China. Endless war and militarism puts all workers at risk. If you're part of the workers' struggle here in the US, then you know the slogan, which side are you on? In the class struggle, it's essential to take sides and remember this essential distinction: people's needs and not capitalist profits. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was very informative and inspiring. I think we all learned a lot about how we can move forward with defending China and information. So I'm going to go to our next speaker, which is KJ No. KJ No is a journalist, educator, and analyst specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific. He is the co-host of the China Report on the BT News Network. KJ will be speaking on what is currently happening on the Korean Peninsula and how it ties to war on China.
So I was actually going to talk a little bit about China, and I will get to Korea. But first thing I want to say is China's great accomplishments. You know, this is the greatest people's success story in modern human history. And I want to emphasize that China liberated itself. It achieved developed status. It is only one of 4 formerly colonized countries or regions to achieve this status. Almost every country that was colonized has not managed to achieve a developed status. They've all stayed in a kind of neo-colonial underdeveloped status. And China did this without slavery, without colonization, without war, without invasion, without primitive accumulation. In other words, it developed on its own terms. It also tackled some extreme crises. 850 million people were brought out of poverty. In the 1980s, China was poorer than Haiti by GDP. And most people don't know this, but it ended the worst drug addiction problem on the planet. In 1949, 90 million people were addicted to opiates. That was about 1/5 of its population. And within 3 years, it got rid of the drug addiction problem. It's currently tackling global warming by creating a revolution in sustainable energy transition. In fact, what we're seeing is the greatest sustainable energy generation transition project on the planet. And it is offering renewables as an affordable global good. It has the greatest carbon capture project on the planet. Namely, it builds forests the size of Belgium every single year. And it's constantly developing new technologies such as molten salt reactors, plasma fusion generation. It's on the cutting edge of that, and nanotechnologies such as reclaiming lithium from seawater for the sustainable reclaiming of lithium. And of course, it's a scientific and economic powerhouse. The top scientific research publication comes out of China. ASPI, China hostile think tank, says that 57 out of 63 critical cutting edge technologies are currently being led by the Chinese. And of course, it's a tech powerhouse. It's maintained technological information sovereignty despite sanctions, despite technological sanctions. And recently it released DeepSeek AI R1. It developed it at probably 100th or 1,000th of the development costs and 1/11th of the training costs. And it's released it as open source, which means that this is AI for everyone. It's opening up the knowledge commons as opposed to enclosing them, which is what you see with the US corporations. And all of this is a common benefit, but then you hear the refrain, at what cost? And of course, you also hear, but is it really socialist? And this is the kind of purity, fetishism, socialism. So I thought I would tackle that a little bit. There's a has-is fallacy. You know, I have something, therefore I am something is a fallacy. I have a dog, therefore I am a dog is a fallacy. The US has socialists, therefore it is socialist is a fallacy. You cannot say China has capitalists, therefore it is capitalist. But people harp on this all the time. If you really want to think about it, you have to ask yourself, has or does any capitalist state have long-term planned economic development for common prosperity? Does any capitalist state have public ownership of land, infrastructure, public goods, the commanding heights of economy, and 60 to 70% of all corporations? Has any capitalist state avoided transitioning to a financialized rentier economy as it becomes monopolistic? Has any capitalist state avoided the capitalist burn and crash cycle of repeated recession? Has any capitalist state virtually eliminated hunger, poverty, illiteracy? Or does it use poverty to create wealth? Has any capitalist committed to ecological and sustainable development, writing that into its constitution? And has any capitalist state implemented a scientific approach to development using trial spots? The answer to all of the above is no. Therefore, China is not capitalist. still people insist, they say China is imperialist, and Sanyika gave a really, really good refutation of that, but I'll just kind of unpack a little bit of the genealogy of this. The people who claim China imperialist are like the people who shout reverse racism. That is, anything opposed to imperialism can only be from other imperialists, just as a challenge to racism must be racist at its foundation. So imperialists, they knee-jerk about reverse imperialism, China imperialist. That's the trope that you will hear from them. And it's like people who say all lives matter, all imperialisms matter, even the ones that they imagine. And they cannot comprehend that escaping from American imperial violence should not be seen as an imperial threat, just as somebody who escapes from the police is not endangering the police. But this knee-jerk trope was given academic formulation by a US-funded anti-China scholar. His name is Haiphong, and he was working out of the deep state think tank SAIS at Johns Hopkins. He had illustrious genocidal colleagues like John Negroponte, Elliot Cohen, Madeleine Albright, and he published his work in Foreign Policy, and then it trickled out into dollar store lefty outlets like Jacobin, and then it circulated as low-rent tokens in the democratic, socialist left and ultra-left and liberal circles. And then it was reappropriated by right-wing think tanks. It's pure propaganda. There's nothing inter-imperial about this conflict because the US is taking the conflict to China, and China is not imperialist, as others have pointed out clearly. The core fallacy, to boil it down to its simplest terms, is that imperialism and colonialism underdevelops the periphery. It impoverishes the periphery, which is exactly the opposite of what BRI and the indigenous sovereign development towards a counter-hegemonic world of multipolarity is doing. So when people use that fallacy, they're doing the work of the imperialists. And then we also always get these kind of ad hominem attacks. They say, tanky. And tanky simply means my mental gas tank is depleted. Words and logic have failed me. All I can muster is invective. And there's a taxonomy. If we wanted to, play the ad hominem game, there are crankies, stankies, wankies, twankies, skankies, and shankies. I won't go into all of them, but crankies are the ones that are really cranky and cantankerous. Wankies are white authoritarian crankies. Twinkies are obsessed with Taiwan province, and they believe in twin imperialism. Skankies want to school you, shankies want to shiv you, etc. We won't go into that. But then people also come on about, oh, what about workers' rights? And I just want to tell you a little story about my friend. He used to use a mayonnaise jar as his water bottle, and this hipster San Francisco dude went up to him and said, I hope you recycle that jar. And his head exploded because he has been using that mayonnaise jar as his water bottle for about 7 years. And he's never had to recycle it because he's never thrown it away. But this is the way that idiots think. They don't understand that if you have a people's republic, it builds wealth for its people, including its workers. And just one benchmark is Chinese manufacturing wages have risen 130-fold in 45 years versus 4 times. In other words, we're focusing on performance and outcomes, not a reified, mystified process that fetishizes institutions or some notion of, process. You have in China what's called a whole process democracy that lifts up the bottom for everybody and creates common collective wealth. So I compare it to the way that voting is fetishized in the West. But just to look at the numbers, China's average wages have increased 12-fold since 2000. They've increased 250-fold, 24,000% since the 1950s. Manufacturing wages have nearly doubled in the past 10 years. They have increased tenfold since 2000, and they have increased over 130-fold since 1980, 12,000%, as opposed to US wages, which have essentially quadrupled since 1980. I will take 12,000% over 300% any time of the day or night. Same thing for minimum wage. US federal minimum wage has flatlined since 2007, has not increased in purchasing value since 1980, whereas in China, since 2006, almost the same period, it's increased 250%. And of course, China is the longest post-retirement life expectancy, between 18 to 28 years. Blue-collar women workers can retire at 50, men can retire at 55, and others retire between 60 and 63. So the life expectancy increases at the same time that people can expect to have a post-work retirement. So this is extraordinary, and these are things that are accomplished without the kind of without the US fetishization. So it's far better to be a worker in China than in the United States, and salaries and public wealth makes life in China much, much more livable. 70% of Chinese millennials own their own home, twice the rate of the US, and between 90 and 96% of Chinese households own their own home, usually without owning a penny. But we are in a kind of a full-on preparation for war. And in information war, the idea is to create a no-think zone or a no critical thinking zone, just as in real war, you have a no-fly zone. And so we're very, very accelerated in that process. And of course, you also see desperation in the empire. South Korea recently just saw an attempted military coup. And this is one of a string of attempted coups across the world. In Bulgaria, Hungary, Bangladesh, even France had an election, and then the ruling party refused to give up power after losing the election. And you see attempts to revert to dictatorships. You see this in Taiwan, you see this in the Philippines, you see this in Korea. And in particular, Korea is very important because Korea has 500,000 active duty troops and 3.1 million reserve troops. And all of these troops fall under US control the moment the US declares DEFCON 3 under conditions of war. Now, South Korea's recent attempt at martial law, i.e. a military coup, was predicated on creating the semblance of an attack from North Korea, a false flag attack from North Korea, and then creating kinetic engagement. And therefore, South Korea would have had a military dictatorship, it would have had a war with North Korea, and under those conditions, all of South Korea's troops would have fallen under US operational control, with which the US could have waged war against China, or it could have sent those troops to Ukraine to fight against, quote unquote, the North Koreans who are fighting for Russia, but who are more elusive than the aliens at Roswell. In fact, it's just a complete canard that they've manufactured. And this explains why you have this lie. So anyway, we're in a very, very dangerous situation. We have to stay in solidarity with and for China. The future of the world depends on it. And part of that is fighting the lies, fighting the information war, and decolonizing your mind, not letting your mind become occupied, because the US military considers mental space a battle, a theater of contestation. Do not let your mind be occupied with anti-China propaganda. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, KJ. That was so great. And I'm so glad we all now have something to use to respond to people when they call us tankies. Very much appreciated. So for our next speaker, we have my lovely co-host, Arjae Red. Arjae is an anti-imperialist and labor organizer and a founding member of Starbucks Workers United in Buffalo, New York. Arjae took part in a delegation to China organized by the China-US Solidarity Network. They are a member of Workers' World Party. Arjae will give a talk on dismantling Western propaganda on Xinjiang. Sorry.
Thanks. Thanks everybody for coming. And I have a lot I want to go through, so I'm just going to start going through my bullet points here. And yeah, I want to talk about my delegation I attended to Xinjiang that was organized by the China-US Solidarity Network. I went with Sara Flounders, who's also on this panel. Xinjiang is important as a topic to discuss because there's a lot of misconceptions around this, especially on the left. It's an economic hotspot in China, and it's crucial to the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's also crucial to the economic development in China internally, and solving the uneven development that's taken place between the western provinces and the eastern coastal cities. And so developing Xinjiang is part of closing the poverty gap, which China has been working diligently towards. And these are some of the reasons why the US is targeting Xinjiang as a focal point for propaganda. The Uyghur genocide narrative is something that is often brought up with this topic. And this narrative is meant to drive a wedge between different ethnic groups within China and stoke divisions, and also justify sanctions. And the sanctions are predicated on the idea that all of the products that are produced in Xinjiang are products of slave labor unless they prove that they are not. And therefore, they're all subject to sanctions. And these sanctions are actually hurting the Uyghur businesses in China. And it makes it so that they're not able to sell to overseas markets. They have to sell a lot of their products internally. So yeah, so this is not to protect Uyghur people by any means. This narrative is actually harming them. And this strategy of division and stoking ethnic conflict and separatism is the same strategy that the US imperialist camp has used in Yugoslavia. It's the same strategy they used with the Soviet Union, and the reason why we have a war between Russia and Ukraine today. So, this is the same playbook that we've seen over and over again, and we should not fall for it a third time. And China has studied this playbook deeply. China is also adjacent to many of the countries that the US has destabilized across Western Asia, countries like Afghanistan, for example. People don't really think about that fact, but China is actually bordering many of these countries on the Western side. So all of the different types of meddling and invasions and bombings that the US carries out, this all actually impacts China, especially in Xinjiang. The US has been backing Uyghur separatist militants in much the same way that we know that the CIA did with Tibetan separatists. The US has turned Syria into a training ground for militants in much the same way that neo-Nazi groups from across Europe and across the world in the US have traveled to Ukraine during the Civil War to actually fight. And then they bring that combat experience back to their home countries and unfortunately increase the right-wing extremism that we have to deal with here. And this is where, in Syria is where a lot of the Uyghur separatist groups have been training as well, even as recently as when Assad's government was overthrown. So this is all something that the US is backing and facilitating either directly or indirectly. China has actually suffered many attacks by some of these separatist groups up until the 2000s. And unfortunately, Uyghur people and other Muslim communities were actually the victims and the targets of a lot of these attacks. China's approach to dealing with this terrorist activity has not been the same as how the US deals with it. All we really need to do is look at how the US reacted after 9/11. The US invaded multiple countries and committed acts of genocide through warfare and sanctions and just absolutely decimated a lot of the countries which it blamed. And we know that China's response to the types of attacks that they used to experience has been completely different. China, on the other hand, recognizes that poverty is the root cause of what leads people to be susceptible to extremist ideas and to get involved in crime and other things like that. So poverty alleviation has actually been the central way of alleviating these attacks from happening. And now these attacks don't happen anymore, and Xinjiang is a safe place. And it was extremely safe when I was there, maybe within the last year or two. So now I want to talk about what I saw while I was in Xinjiang. I saw a really vibrant culture. It was probably the most diverse place that I've ever been in my life, as far as the architecture, the different types of music and art and dance that I saw. The food was probably the best part about it. I could talk just about the food for another hour. You know, I didn't see any evidence of religious or cultural suppression or censorship, as the US media claims. You know, we visited a couple different mosques, including Uyghur mosques and Hui mosques. I saw many different languages posted all over on signs, businesses signs, street signs. You know, sometimes you'd see 4 to 5 different languages, you know, which really is not even something you see in the US, despite how many different language communities we have in our cities here. It's usually learn English or get out is the attitude that unfortunately the US tends to take. But yeah, we also visited some museums in Xinjiang that teach the history of Uyghur people and the other ethnic and national groups that live there. So this is not something that's suppressed. It's something that is celebrated and taught openly. Some of the people that we spoke to Uyghur families, Kazakh and Tajik families, other national groups that are there. We spoke with a Uyghur store owner who I actually asked them about, you know, different questions about, you know, what do you think about the Uyghur genocide that's going on? What can you tell me about it? And he actually has never heard of it. He asked me to explain what that even was. And then, you know, after I did that, he kind of laughed and said he's just never heard of it before. You know, we asked about the relationship to the CPC that the community has. Does the Communist Party enjoy support or criticism from their community? You know, what's the relationship like? And what I was told was that a lot of people support the Communist Party because, especially during COVID, the Young Communist League actually went door to door through the different neighborhoods and delivered groceries and food and other necessities that people needed, which is something that would have been really nice to see in this country. But unfortunately, we know that didn't happen. We also spoke with some farmers and veterinarians. We learned about some of the affirmative action programs that the state and the Communist Party have in place to pay for schooling for children of ethnic minority groupings, also grants for small businesses. I talked with a veterinarian that said that he was actually given basically a ride to college from the state in order to be trained as a veterinarian, and now he teaches apprentice veterinarians because the town that they were in, it was a smaller farming village. They didn't have a veterinarian. And I asked, you know, what happens if the farmers need to, you know, if their sheep get sick and they don't have enough money to get the sheep treated? And he told me that the government would pay for the sheep's treatment. And I said, so basically what you're telling me is the sheep in China have better healthcare than the people in the US do. And yeah, so we also talked with some construction workers. I spoke with a Uyghur family. The husband was a construction worker. And at the time I was working in the bricklayers union as a tile setter. So we kind of both were doing the same work. And we, you know, we talked about the different labor protections, and wage theft was a big thing. He said that his boss at one point had stolen some money from him that he owed him. And the government actually followed up with this and forced his boss to pay him in full what he owed him, which as somebody who was involved in trying to get the sweat bill passed in New York State where I live, for like the last few years, we know that if you live in New York State, I don't know if it's the same in Oregon, but there's actually no laws forcing your employer to pay you if they commit wage theft. And wage theft is the biggest form of theft in New York State. So that was like a very stark difference. I was very surprised to hear about that. But, you know, that just goes to reaffirm the socialist character of the, you know, workers' dictatorship that they have there. And lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about Xinjiang and Gaza, because, you know, unfortunately, the US media tries to compare these two things. They try to divert the anger that people are rightly, you know, directing against Israel, and they try to redirect it against China, and unfortunately split up the world anti-imperialist movement. You know, when we look at Gaza, we can see what a real genocide looks like. We can see that Gaza has been completely turned into rubble. It's a massive humanitarian crisis beyond what any of us can even imagine. And, you know, it's nothing like what we saw in Xinjiang. I don't even really know what to say about that comparison because it couldn't be further from the truth. And I think that needs to be said. You know, I think that we can just see from the videos of what we see in Gaza and, you know, what we saw when we were on the ground in Xinjiang, that China builds and Israel and the US bomb and destroy. China is a multinational worker state. And the Uyghurs and Tibetans and the many other ethnic groups in China are a central and integral part of the revolution that took place that threw off the chains of feudalism and colonialism. And I think it's also worth mentioning that the socialist revolution in China actually restored a lot of the traditional Uyghur names of the cities and villages that they lived in that before the revolution actually had Han names. And they had erased the Uyghur names, but that was actually reversed after the socialist revolution. So there's actually been a resurgence of the Uyghur language being used and also taught in schools, along with other languages that are spoken. You know, Israel, in contrast to that, is a Zionist settler colony, and it's an appendage of the world imperialist system. You know, it's predicated on the theft of land and the super exploitation of Palestinians. Uyghur culture is celebrated, and it's a crucial part of making China the strong nation that it is today. And Israel, on the other hand, can only exist through the exclusion and the elimination of the Palestinians. So I think that needs to be said without a shadow of a doubt that this comparison is it's BS. I'll put it that way. And that's all. And thank you everybody for listening today. And yeah, we're just going to conclude the panel here, and we're actually going to move into a Q&A. We have a few minutes left. So for the attendees that we have here in the library, we're actually going to be taking some questions here. We can start by taking 3 questions. We'll give each person, if you have a question, 2 minutes to ask it. And then we'll give the panelists a chance to jump on. We'll take the 3 questions all at once, and then you can answer them in whatever order you want, or you can pick and choose which ones you want to take. So if you do have a question that you'd like to ask, please raise your hand. We'll just get a count here. We've got 1 question. Got 2 questions. Do we have a 3rd question? Okay, if the 2 that have questions, if you'd like to come up, just so the audience on Zoom can hear and you can ask it into the microphone. Yeah, if you'd like to come up first. Yeah, I think this is the microphone. Or no, the laptop is the microphone. So yeah, you can come right
close to here.
Yeah. If you'd like to.
My spouse and I and others are very interested in going to China and traveling with comrades. And I know that you've done that. And I wonder if there's other opportunities within the next year or so that we could take advantage of that and do that.
Great. So yeah, if anybody knows any active opportunities, any delegations to attend, we'll get the other question if you'd like to come up.
My question is mainly a question I get, or a point I get from a lot of people about billionaires in China. It's constantly an issue brought up to me as a major contradiction. But I guess my question is, how does the CPC, or how is this addressed, and how, if any, what are the efforts done to diminish the influence of billionaires in China and capitalist class as a whole? So, thank you.
Last question is, what do we as socialists here in the Imperial Court do to support China moving forward and to fight against imperialism once and for all? What's the course of action we need to take?
Perfect. And any other questions in here? Sure. Would you like to come up and ask? Yeah, thank you. Oh, right there in front of the computer. Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess I'm a believer in, I would call it ethno-territorial rationality. So I absolutely support the right of China to get back its renegade province of Taiwan. And I realize that, that will probably, because of this country's I think this country really does want to grab Taiwan because of its super production of microchips, superconductor chips. The problem I have is the Han Chinese people, I really don't agree with their occupation of areas that are ethnically non-Han Chinese. The occupation of Uyghuristan, which I call, Xinjiang. Xinjiang, they call it Xinjiang, I call it Uyghuristan, and the occupation of Greater Tibet and Southern Mongolia. So I think more in terms of a Turkic federation from Turkey to Azerbaijan to of the 6 main Eurasian Turkic-speaking states, which Uyghuristan.
Is there a question?
I realize some people think that
Is there a question?
Imperialist countries would like to grab that sort of.
Hello, is there a question?
But,
I
think I know why the Han Chinese are interested. Yeah, I will. 10 seconds.
Is there a question?
They're
Bro.
interested in strategic minerals and water resources in those areas. That's it. Thank you.
Got to echo. Thank you for asking. All right. Yeah, so if the panelists, if you want to get on stack to respond to some of these, you can take whichever ones in whatever order you'd like. And Holly and I will manage the stack here. I see we've got Mick Kelly on stack. We've got Danny on stack. And anybody else? I'll get on stack, but I'll let others go first. We've got Sanyika on stack. Sanyika, why don't you go first, and then we'll go Mick and then Danny.
Are these the only questions we're answering?
And then we'll take another stack. I see we've also got Keith. So
wait, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
You can go.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, I'll answer the second to last question and then the last question, but since people have been asking a lot of questions about Haiphong shoot, I think there was a really good response to an American asking a question about, will China come save us, or like, what do you guys want to like, how are you guys going to help us deal with like American imperialism from the inside? And this random account was like, if an egg breaks from the outside, it's a meal, but if it breaks from the inside, it's a new beginning. And so like the only way to help China has been the consistent way that China has articulated its preference for any interaction with any nation, which is for those people to get it for themselves, to do it for themselves. And so what is good for China is also good for most of us in the United States, which is the end of imperialism, which is the task that we have been given by merit of being born here or traveling here or residing here. So I think that's the bottom line of it. If it comes into specifics, we don't support imperialist incursion into China, which goes into the last question. Well, the first thing is historically, Han Chinese, I don't know how to say this. Han Chinese does not operate as the same identity as, like, let's say a Euro-Anglo-American, like being white, right? Han Chinese and being white are not analogous identities. And so sometimes when people talk about Han Chinese people, it doesn't actually really hold up when you're not using American racial ontologies. So what you would consider Han Chinese people were actually in Xinjiang before the Turkic people who are known as the Uyghurs were. So when we do this like settler colonialism thing, it just does not add up with history. That is not to say that Uyghur people do not have a claim to living in Xinjiang and that they're not welcome there, but it's to say that you can't use the same argument that we would use as like Native Americans and European settlers is the same relationship, because it's just simply not. These are people who have always lived next to each other, who will continue to live next to each other, and that is going to be, a fact that you can't separate from Taiwan, from Tibet, from anywhere that China is. And also the other thing is, people mention the one China policy in Taiwan or in China. And one of the reasons that the one-child policy was actually critiqued is that all of the ethnic minorities in China were exempt from the one-child policy. Every ethnic minority in China, they all take this giant test. It's called the Gaokao. It is the most consequential thing you could ever do, right? It's a very hard exam. I'm not gonna lie, because they take education so seriously over there. If you're an ethnic minority in China, you automatically get points on your Gaokao. There's nothing. You don't have to explain why your ethnicity does X, Y, and Z. It's not up for debate like it is in the United States, where we have affirmative action based on very nebulous terms. You simply just get more points on your exam to ensure that ethnic minorities get the same opportunities that so-called Han Chinese people get. So I think we have to rethink what we know about China, what we know about the ethnic groups of China. Take, for instance, the Hui Muslim population, who were Han Chinese people that were like, they were considered Han Chinese people that reverted to Islam. Now they're an ethnic group because they're Muslim, but they're not actually any different than Han Chinese people. So I would just implore you to do a little bit more incursion into the Han identity, how it operates, and what that means for the territorial integrity of China.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, that was a good response. Very good. I want to do Mick next, and then Danny.
Yeah, I want to speak to 2 points. One is the issue of billionaires in China. And I get why that would bum people out and stuff, but I think that if you look at the reality of China's development since the reform and opening up period 1978, you can see that an economic miracle has been accomplished. And I agree with Sara said earlier. There's a basic question that's who's in charge? And I would say the billionaires aren't. And furthermore, my inclination would be to push back a little bit against the idea that there's a billionaire class in China. That just simply from the standpoint of taxonomy, if you have 1, 10, 40 billionaires, that doesn't necessarily give you a class. You have to have a theory of class formation and how they were forged in a historical process as a class, and typically that would involve class struggles. So I would not necessarily agree with the idea that they constitute a class. And furthermore, I think all of us have noticed the phenomenon of China's disappearing billionaires, which has taken place over the past couple of years. On the issue of a multinational China, yeah, there is a lot of nationalities in China. I think about 63 language groups, maybe more. And when I was in China some 50 odd years ago or 50 years ago, there was a person who was in charge of the Tibet Autonomous Region, and the man couldn't see. And the reason he couldn't see is because the slavocracy that ruled Tibet put a stone hat on his head, and he had his eyes carved out. And that's the reality of the semi-slave society that existed in Tibet. And some people say, oh, the lamas, they're kind and fine people, the Dalai Lama specifically. And it wasn't a kind and decent society at all. It was, in fact, barbaric. You could actually go on for hours chronicling their crimes. And the fact of the matter is, Chinese, the People's Liberation Army in particular, created the conditions for the peaceful transition, a great revolution in Tibet, which it was able to put an end to a semi-slave, semi-serf society. And it really is one of the great accomplishments of the Chinese Revolution. And I think to say otherwise is to confound right and wrong.
Thank you, Mick. Danny, if you want to go up next.
Sure. Well, I'll address the last statement and maybe the billionaire question as well, because I think it's a good one. First, it's interesting. We heard Arjae right before the question and answer give a very detailed analysis of what he actually saw. And for me, I've been to Xinjiang twice, and it's just so interesting that we in the United States, again, are so captive to narratives and are so captive to the way that the mainstream media and the way the Western media portrays China, in particular Xinjiang, that we use these terms like occupation. We believe that there is some kind of human rights catastrophe in this part of China. But the reality is that uh, occupation, this is a very, very critical term that we have to use very precisely. We cannot just throw it around. China, there is no internal occupation inside of China. China is one of the most open countries in the world for people to travel to. And uh, it is really important that we look at the difference between occupation, let's say in Palestine, let's say what legitimate, real occupations that we see around the world, mainly, if not primarily, and solely led by the United States, Israel, and similar Western imperial regimes, and the reality that we find in China, which is the strangest occupations of all and the strangest genocides or human rights catastrophes of all, where you have people's lives improving. The people in Xinjiang, in this Uyghur autonomous region, where Uyghurs are a plurality, but there are literally dozens of other ethnic groups that live all across this province, to see the fact that this nomadic, mainly herder people for many, 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 many centuries now live in a modern way. Their wages, their living conditions have exploded on an upward trajectory. To see all of that with your own eyes, and to see the fact that China, it's just so interesting to believe that China has an internal occupation without any evidence that has ever been presented of such a thing actually existing in the most open country in the world. It is almost laughable that we can stand up and repeat these narratives without simply wondering what the hell are we actually doing. That is the first step, in my opinion, is to really look deeply in our, internally ourselves, and ask ourselves, why is this even something that I could possibly believe in when there's absolutely no evidence that such a thing exists? Now, the question of billionaires in China, again, if you travel to China, if you experience China and then you study China's political economy, you can see that what Eric Lee, another Communist Party member who happens to be a communist, a member of the Communist Party who happens to be a capitalist, he said it quite plainly in John Pilger's very good documentary, The Late John Pilger, rest in power to him. In The Coming War on China, he told John Pilger, in China, the government controls the capitalists. In the United States and in the West, the capitalists control the government. And so that is one of the most simple explanations that we can give to ordinary people to begin the process of understanding China better and its political economy as a rising socialist country with Chinese characteristics that is doing everything it can to raise the standard of living of people, to build the conditions for a modern socialist country by 2050. And if you go to China and you see how people are living there, if you see the conditions that now even capitalists like Tim Cook the CEO of Apple, has to admit to, that actually China is no longer a low-wage country. It is no longer an impoverished country. It is no longer a country that the United States and the collective West can simply hope to exploit any longer. That is the big problem that the United States and the West has with China. And billionaires themselves in China, they simply serve a function. They can live good lives, but the minute that we saw this with Jack Ma, and we see this in the anti-corruption campaign in China, the minute that their business interests begin to impact in a harmful way the overall society, they are dealt with. And that is a profound difference from how the United States and the collective West do things. And that's all I have. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danny. Next up on stack, we have Keith.
All right. I'll try to be brief because we've had some brilliant responses to the questions already. Like I think just about everyone else has replied, I wanted to say something about the last contribution that was made from the audience. I say contribution rather than a question. And as Danny in particular not only presented a huge number of facts in response, but also pointed out that even before the point was raised, Arjae had actually dealt with it in detail in a very vivid way, based on his experiences of going to Xinjiang, as indeed has Danny, which, I strongly suspect that the person who raised the point has not had that kind of lived experience. The specific point I would like to make is that the premise of his assertion appears to be that every state has to be a mono or single ethnic state. I'm sure that this would not be his intention, and he might be somewhat offended to hear it. But this idea that a state has to be comprised solely of a single ethnicity, that it has to be based essentially on some kind of racial or national exclusionism, is actually a deeply reactionary a concept. It's a concept which I would associate more with fascism than with anything else. The reality is that, like many other countries in the world, China is a multi-ethnic country, a multi-ethnic society, and has developed in that way for thousands of years. The very concept of Tibetan independence, and incidentally, the phrase Greater Tibet was used. There's no such place as a Greater Tibet. But the very concept or idea of Tibetan independence was something invented by British imperialism at the end of the 19th century in order to invade China, in order to prize Tibet out of China, in order to try and break up China, to make the whole of China, most definitely including Tibet, a base for the super exploitation of the Chinese people. If one looks at Chinese history, the idea that that the Chinese nation, the Chinese people can simply be reduced to the Han is belied on every single historical basis that you could imagine. There are, off the top of my head, at least 2 dynasties in Chinese history which were not Han dynasties. The last dynasty in China was the Qing dynasty. That was the Qing dynasty were Manchus, a very small nationality in China. The Yuan dynasty, back in approximately the 13th century, were Mongolians. And this has always been, up to and including today, the way that China has functioned. And I'd just like to also make a comparison with what Sanyika has put forward in terms of revolutionary Pan-Africanism. If we followed this logic, Africa would be divided, rather than coming together in order to develop, Africa would be divided into hundreds of different countries, which of course would suit imperialism extremely well, because that would be a much easier thing for imperialism to dominate. Just very briefly on the other question that was raised, because the question was raised of what do we do? How can we support China here? And of course, that's a very important question, and the time doesn't allow us to go into detail on it. But one of the things we can do to support China is precisely to have these kind of meetings and discussions, and to put forward, and particularly to hear from people who've been to China and actually seen the reality for themselves. But we have to, I think we have to take the reality of China and the case for China into the progressive movements, particularly into the anti-war and peace movements, because there is that, and as Sara outlined, that growing threat, and other speakers, that growing threat of war against China. But it's also the case, that China is now a very powerful country, and a very powerful economy, as Mick pointed out, that on some basis like purchasing power parity, that China is already a bigger economy than the United States. So China is somewhat different in compared to many other countries that we stand in solidarity with, in that China is very well able to look after itself. So the main thing in supporting China, in understanding China, in spreading understanding of Chinese socialism, China's realities, China's contribution to Marxism, what we're actually engaged is, which I think is very, very important, is building our own movements in our own countries, because of the leading role and the increasingly the special role that China is playing in the world socialist movement, and that China has so much to teach us and inspire us in the development of our own struggles. So Chairman Mao always used to say that support is always mutual, and I think this is a great example of it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Keith. So next up we have Sara, but before we go ahead to our next few panelists and their responses, just want to ask, we are a little bit over time, so just want to ask everybody to maybe keep your responses to 60 seconds if possible. So next we're going to go to Sara.
Let me give that a try. Quickly on three of the points, there are lots of ways to visit China. We went as part of the China Solidarity Network, but there are all kinds of ways, not hard to find out. I want to just touch on the billionaires in China, because really China exists in a capitalist world, and billionaires did not exist in the first years of China. But how can China deal with the West? Now, lots of US corporations and the US as a whole refuse to deal with the state-owned enterprises. And so one way in which China had of getting the technology, the funding, the investment, was to have, quote, individual billionaires. Money is in their name, maybe for this generation, but they're under the discipline and control. And just to reinforce that point that Danny made, that in China, the billionaires are under government control, and here we know they run the show. We have no say, and the political system here has no space for all of us, only for the billionaires. But I really, the last question that was asked today, I just think shows the imperialist arrogance that runs through claiming to represent the dismemberment of China as somehow being in the interests of some national grouping in China. And this is a kind of fraud, really, that has for so long used Tibet or Xinjiang or Mongolia and saying, well, these should be separate areas. We should rip China apart. And they will say it on countries as large as China or Russia or as small as Nicaragua. They will tell you any country that they are opposed to has got to be pulled apart in the interests of some grouping who really in every way benefits in a new society. And final point on that, we should look at the indigenous peoples of the US, where everything of culture and language and land and space is suppressed and never given a real right to. And in China, there is every ability for everything from the schools to representation in the highest levels of government and in the party for the all different nationalities of China, and a preservation of the languages and culture that I don't think it's matched anywhere in the world. So let's not play into the imperialist game about pretending to respect one grouping over another as a way of pulling China apart. They're very well able to deal with this. And they're also, by the way, able to deal with their billionaires who did give access to the technology that China is now really far outpacing the US with. So they did have a role. Thanks so much for the program.
I'm going to talk very
On stack, we have KJ.
I'm going to talk very briefly about ethnic minorities. The first point I want to make is ethnic minorities are 8% of the population, but they possess 45% of the territory of China. You will not find that ratio anywhere else in the world with ethnic minorities. So that in and of itself, I think, speaks volumes. But the other piece I want to highlight is that I am Korean. And Koreans are an ethnic minority in China. And there is no other place on the planet where I can exercise and speak my culture and speak my language and have the civil and cultural rights that I would have in China. Not in the United States, certainly not in Japan, where I would have to literally hide my identity as a Korean. So I think what China's done with ethnic minorities is really exemplary. And as for those who talk about irredentist claims, if we were to make the same argument, then you would have to make the argument that the Liaodong Peninsula should be ceded to Korea. These are things that are decided, have been decided through international compact, and it's not something that some Western, armchair theorist has the right to mediate on. What Sara said is also correct. Even the smallest ethnic minorities, some which are as small as 2,000 or 3,000 people, have full representation at the highest levels of the Chinese legislative system. And that's, once again, something that you will never find anywhere else. Certainly, you will not find that in the United States. You do not see representations of any indigenous tribes in the US Congress, regardless of how big or small they are. It's completely different. The last thing I will talk about is when you think about Xinjiang, we've already had testimony from Danny and Arjae and others. You have to understand that there are 250 million people that visit Xinjiang every single year. In other words, it's not just an anecdote from Danny or Arjae. We have 250 million samples or anecdotes, and I think that should tell you something right off the bat. But the key thing that we have to do to support China is to stop repeating these lies. Do not let your mind be colonized with Western propaganda. If you are in this mindset where all imperialisms matter, if you're saying twin imperialisms, China capitalist, if you fall into the has-is fallacy, you are already part of the problem that is escalating or generating this escalation to war. And I think it's incumbent on all of us, both as individuals and as a collective, to challenge these lies that are part of the information warfare, which is part of this pre-kinetic preparation for war.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to wrap up the stack here. And then after I'll go, actually, I wanted to see if Sanyika wanted to make one last comment about what she put in the chat, but just real quick to add to what others have already said on this question, the question of self-determination of different ethnic groups and especially of the Uyghurs. As others have said, China is a multi-ethnic country. I think that we need to remember that just as Soviet did not necessarily mean Russian, there was Ukrainians, there was Kazakhs, there was many other nations within Soviet Union. So those two words were not synonymous. Soviet and Russian were not synonymous. Just like Yugoslavian and Serbian are not synonymous. Just like Chinese and Han are not necessarily synonymous either. Uyghur people are just as much a part of the Chinese identity as Han people are. I want to talk about self-determination, the idea of self-determination, which is a part of Marxism-Leninism, which is what I subscribe to, and it's what the foundation of Chinese society is built on, and what self-determination actually means in that context. Self-determination in the Leninist sense does not mean, forced separation or forced independence. Self-determination is the ability of a people to choose whether they want to integrate, whether they want to separate, or have some other, form of relationship with other ethnic groups within their nation. And it's not on anybody outside of that country or that community to, suggest what the ideal relationship should be. You know, the path of integration into one multi-ethnic country is just as valid of a path as, you know, the choice to separate into, you know, maybe take like a federative model like, you know, other countries have. China, rather than a federative model, has a model of regional ethnic autonomy. So they actually do have self-governance at the local level for both Uyghurs and Tibetans and other national minority populations within the country. So a lot of the laws that are created and policies, they're actually created at the local level by people within those communities. And that's another unique, you know, as opposed to the US, which has, you know, no representation for the Black people in the US, except for what is a neo-colonial relationship. And as far as the indigenous nations are concerned, it's basically relegated to reservations. So I want to talk about one last thing is the, you know, if you look at the majority of the Uyghur community that is pushing for this separatist viewpoint, it's the minority, and it's, from what I've seen, pretty much confined to the diaspora. And a lot of the NGOs that are pushing for the separatist narrative, you can actually look up that all of their headquarters are based in Washington, D.C. and in the United Kingdom, like groups like the World Uyghur Congress and things like that. So, you know, that kind of speaks for itself, whose interests that's serving. And last thing I want to say on the billionaires within the Communist Party, we've talked about that and the fact that they're subject to party discipline because of that. But the flip side of that that doesn't get mentioned is the fact that not only are they now subject to party discipline by having billionaires within the party, but communist cadre from the party actually sit on the boards of many of these corporations and influence the decisions that these companies make from the inside, as well as the fact that most of them are either in part or majority state-owned enterprises. So I think that's important to say as well. I wanted to ask if Sanyika wanted to make a final comment on what she put in the chat, and otherwise we are over time, and I want to just thank everybody for their participation today.
No,
And we also wanted
And if all the panelists could just turn your cameras on briefly before we end so that we could take a nice little photo of everybody.
screenshot. My apologies. Did I interrupt?
Say again, sir?
I think Sanyika was saying something. I was worried I
Oh,
interrupted.
I was just saying I didn't have anything else to add. Sorry.
Whoever's taking the screenshot, is that all done? All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And yeah, that concludes our event today. Thank you, everybody online, for tuning in. Thank you, everybody that came out to the library today. It's actually packed. And so, yeah, I'm super happy we got to do this. And thank you, Holly, my excellent co-host.
Yeah.
And I look forward to working with you again.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much.